Hello all, I hope you can all hear me. Um, so welcome to another year. It looks like, at least for this course, it's going to be another year online. And the way I like to start off lectures, a habit I've gotten into, is that before every lecture, I pick a suitable background, something that's relevant to the course or relevant to the particular lecture for the day. And so today's background, this is Echo Lake. This is a lake kind of in the North Okanagan, a little, well, kind of handy to Lumbee. And it's in a little valley called the Creighton Valley. I took this perhaps about a month ago when we were immersed in a lot of smoke. And so you can see very smoky skies there. Anyway, I was up sampling the lake at that time and took this photograph while I was sampling lakes for the days that we'll need for this course. Okay, so recording, I think I've got the recording turned on here. Okay, next I'm going to give you a lecture. Okay, next I'm going to give you an introductory lecture. And so I will need to share a screen again here in a moment. Now let's see. Now, hopefully everybody can see that. So you should be able to see my PowerPoint there at the moment. Okay, get my breath here for a second, and then we'll go. Okay, an introduction to limnology. Oops, let's see. Okay, an introduction to limnology. Okay, so first I want to talk a little bit about the origins of limnology. And, you know, we can potentially trace the origins of limnology back to a number of individuals. And one of those peoples that we might think of as being one of the originators of limnology is Anton von Leeuwenhoek. And, you know, it's pretty fuzzy exactly when did limnology begin. I imagine that even during times of the ice ages, there were primitive people sitting around on sides of lakes and thinking about them. So, you know, it gets pretty fuzzy exactly when any particular science originated. But Anton von Leeuwenhoek is one person that people have associated with the origins of limnology. And of course, he was Dutch. He's considered to be the father of microbiology, and he's best known for advances in microscopy. So what's his connection to limnology? Well, he described back in 1674 a filamentous green alga, Spirogyra. And so, of course, Spirogyra is an aquatic alga. And so we could think of that as being the marking the origins of biological limnology. It's a little bit of a stretch, but we might think of that. Perhaps a person that might be more strongly associated with the origins of limnology is Jean-Christophe Fatio de Doye. This fellow was a Swiss engineer who in 1706 was elected as a Fellow of the Royal Society of London. And in 1730, he was the first person to accurately record an observation of a seiche, which is a kind of standing wave. We'll be talking about these later on in the course. And he recorded that in a Swiss lake. So we might think of that as representing the origins of physical limnology. Another person who might be considered a pioneer in terms of limnology is this fellow, Christian Andreas Victor Hensen. He's a German zoologist. He was a professor of physiology at the University of Kiel, and he laid the foundations for biological oceanography. He, in 1887, introduced the term plankton. And plankton is a term that we use in reference to organisms that are kind of suspended in the water column in lakes and in the ocean that are really largely at the mercy of currents for their distribution. They aren't particularly strong swimmers, and so wherever the water tends to flow in currents, that's where the plankton tend to collect. Next, another fellow, Francois-Alphonse Forel. Anyway, Forel was actually a professor of medicine at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland in the late 19th century. And, late 19th century, we mean from 1800 through to 1900, that time period. And, like a lot of people in his day, they were very broadly trained. And so although he's a professor of medicine, he's interested in other things and, tends to get involved. If you read up about Charles Darwin, he was interested in all kinds of things, earthworms and geology, all kinds of stuff. And that was, pretty common in those days. If you were a scientist, you tend to have pretty broad interests. Anyway, Forel is the person most commonly regarded as the father of limnology. In fact, he coined the term limnology. He coined the term limnology, which of course is the title for this course. Now, what did he do that he deserves this or thought to deserve this recognition? Well, he published very extensively on Lake Geneva. So in 1869, he published on the bottom fauna of Lake Geneva. In 1892, he published on the geology and physics of Lake Geneva. In 1895, he published on its chemistry, and in 1904 on its biology. So he published again on all aspects of Lake Geneva. Remember, he was a professor of medicine. You might regard this as kind of a sideline for him. Anyway, he published very extensively. Now, this term limnology that he coined, it's derived from two words, limnos and logos. So limnos refers literally to a lake, pool, or swamp, and logos to a discourse. So a literal translation of the term limnology would be, limnology is a discourse on lakes, pools, or swamps. And swamps. But Forel had his own definition for it. He regarded limnology as being the oceanography of lakes. The oceanography of lakes. And so you can see that this is a course that parallels oceanography. We're talking about inland waters, but there's a lot of parallels between limnology and oceanography. You can transfer a lot of the information back and forth. If you understand limnology, you're pretty well prepared to understand oceanography and vice versa. Well, as limnology grew as a science, there was an international association. The International Association of Limnology was established. And it was founded in 1922 at Kiel University in Germany. And this being an international society, they decided to use a Latinized name for it. So I don't know exactly how you pronounce this, but something like Societas Internationalis Limnologiae. If you have any ancient Roman friends around, you can ask them whether I've got that pronunciation correct. I have no idea. Okay. Anyway, this International Association of Limnology was co-founded by two guys. It was co-founded by August Tienemann, who was a German scientist, and Einar Naumann, who was a Swede. And at that time, they redefined limnology. And they redefined limnology as the study of inland waters. As a study of inland waters. And this actually broadens the definition of limnology. So they broadened the definition of limnology beyond just looking at lakes. Okay? So the study of inland waters, if you look at that, that phrase, you can read into it that this is not just a biological discipline. This is a discipline that involves biology, chemistry, physics, geology, and anything else to do with inland waters. Okay? You know, I'm sure you could find people who deal with the anthropology of inland waters. So anything to do with inland waters falls within the discipline of limnology. Another thing I should point out, it says inland waters, it doesn't say fresh waters. So some inland waters are very salty. Okay? Now, Okanagan Lake and Wood Lake and Kalamalka Lake, the major lakes in our valley, are all fresh water. But there are some smaller lakes around that are saltwater. So just behind campus, there's a little lake, Robert Lake, that is a saline lake, a saltwater lake. And in many regions of the world, particularly arid regions, there are lakes that are saltier than the ocean. You know, so just because something's saline doesn't make it, doesn't exclude it from limnology. In fact, the Caspian Sea, you know, the Caspian Sea is completely enclosed by land. And so it's actually an inland water. We can think of it as being a giant saltwater lake. So it would be an appropriate subject for limnologists as well. Note that there's also no reference to size. We could be studying large, very large inland waters like Lake Superior or the Caspian Sea or Lake Huron or Great Slave Lake, or we consider very small inland bodies of water. In fact, you want to stretch things, you can think of little pools of water that collect in pitcher plant leaves and so on. We also, it also doesn't say standing waters. It refers to both running waters and standing waters. Okay, so limnologists make a distinction between lotic waters and lentic waters. Lotic waters are running waters. So a spring, a brook, a creek, a stream, a river, those are examples, all examples of running waters. We regard those as being lotic waters. Lentic waters, these are standing water habitats. So lakes, ponds, pools, puddles, and as you get at the extreme small end, water that collects in tree holes or in the leaves of pitcher plants, those are all lentic waters and, you know, would fall within the scope of limnology. Not many people that take it that far, but there's nothing in the definition that says that would exclude those kinds of habitats. Now, a little bit about these two co-founders of the International Association of Limnology. We have Einar Naumann. Einar Naumann, as I mentioned, was a Swede. He was an assistant professor of botany and limnology at the University of Lund. And the University of Lund is in southern Sweden. And if you go to the University of Lund, you'll find out that it is the oldest university in Sweden. But it's not the oldest Swedish university, my Swedish friends tell me, because at the time it was established, it was actually in a part of Denmark. So the boundaries there between Sweden and Denmark shifted over the years. Okay, anyway, he was a professor at the University of Lund, and it was a part of Sweden at the time he was a professor there. And Naumann was a phytoplankton ecologist. In other words, he's interested in algae, or was interested in algae. So phytoplankton really refers to floating algae in water. That's largely what it relates to. So phytoplankton refers to photosynthetic organisms, so phyto, plants, and plankton drifting at the mercy of the currents. So these are small organisms that are capable of photosynthesis drifting in the water column. Anyway, Einar Naumann developed a classification of lakes based on their algal production. That's one of his principal claims to fame. And so he developed a lake classification, And in establishing this lake classification, he borrowed some terms that were first used by Weber in 1907 for a nutrient supply to bog ecosystems. So he borrowed three terms from Weber: oligotrophic, eutrophic, and dystrophic. So Weber had used these in reference to bogs, but Naumann transferred them to his work on lakes. So oligotrophic, this is a term that we use in reference to unproductive clear water lakes, such as you find in northern Europe, northernmost Europe. Also refer to clear, unproductive lakes as being oligotrophic. Then we have eutrophic. These are highly productive clear water lakes. So they're much more productive. They have much higher concentrations of nutrients typically in them. And these are more typical of lakes in southern Sweden bordering the Baltic. And then also he mentions dystrophic lakes. These are brown water lakes, lakes that contain a lot of suspended humic matter. They're kind of common in boreal type forests within the taiga worldwide, well, around the northern hemisphere anyway. Okay. So anyway, this lake classification that Naumann developed emphasizes the relationships between algal production and nutrient loading to lakes. So here are some examples of lakes that would be included in Naumann's classification. So this is a lake, a large lake in northern Sweden, the lake Tornatrask in northernmost Sweden and Abisko. And so you can see kind of the setting. So we're up around tree line in northernmost Sweden. It's a good example of a clear water, nutrient poor lake. Whereas here, this is a photograph I took of a lake in Hillerød, Denmark, and I believe the name of the lake is Slottsø, which translates as Castle Lake. And there's a beautiful castle in the middle of this scummy lake that has just huge concentrations of algae growing in it. It's really scummy, as you can see from the colors of that water. I have some even more disgusting photos from it elsewhere that I'll show you later in the course. And then a third lake, this is Lake Gribse in Denmark. It's a dystrophic lake, and if I took a cup full of water up so you could take a look at it, you would see that the water has kind of a tea color to it. Now, the water's not clear, it's kind of brown because of the humic substances suspended in the water. So that was Naumann, one of the co-founders of limnology. Now, his colleague, co-founder of this international association, was August Tienemann. Now, August Tienemann was German. He was an associate professor of hydrobiology at the University of Kiel, and he was not interested so much in phytoplankton or algae. He was interested in the fauna of lakes, and in particular, the bottom fauna living in lakes. And so he developed a classification of lakes that was based on their midge faunas. So what species of insects lived in the depths of these lakes? So Tienemann's classification for lakes pertained to three lake types. He spoke of chronomous lakes, Tanny-Tarsus lakes, and chronomous plus Corythra lakes. Now, these are based on, chronomous and Tanny-Tarsus are both species of midges, members of the family Chronomidae. And chronomous is one that's associated with lakes where there's low oxygen. This is chronomous over here. Chronomous contains high concentrations of hemoglobin inside its body, which allows it to trap large amounts of oxygen, store up some oxygen for times when it isn't present, and so they're well adapted to low oxygen conditions in lakes. Whereas Tanny-Tarsus lacks the hemoglobin and is characteristic of lakes with high hemoglobin. So if imagine something similar here that maybe is kind of greenish or tan colored in appearance. Then he had a third kind of lakes Chronimus plus Corythra lakes. So there's Chronimus, and Corythra now has a new name. Used to be called Corythra, but now we refer to these as Chiabris. And Chiabris are, well, they may spend part of their time in the bottom of lakes, but they also, during the night at least, drift up into the water column, where they become potential fish food, and they are almost perfectly transparent. So Chiabris are commonly known as phantom midges, or one of my friends likes to refer to them as invisible insects. They're so clear that if you catch them in, you know, a sample bottle, they're very difficult to actually see there. But all you can see are these two black structures in here, which are actually hydrostatic organs that contain a certain amount of oxygen. And they can kind of inflate these organs or deflate them, and that regulates their buoyancy in the water column. So they can move up and down in the water column. In any case, when Naumann and Tienemann got together, they started to realize that, hey, you know, our classifications, although they're based on different things, actually have some parallels. So Tienemann started to equate his Chronimus lakes with Naumann's eutrophic lakes, his Tanitarsus lakes with oligotrophic lakes, and his Chronimus plus Corythra lakes with dystrophic lakes. So although they had different starting points, Naumann looking at algae, phytoplankton, Tienemann looking at insects burrowing into the bottom muds of lakes, they realized that they're largely talking about the same kinds of lakes, despite the different starting points. Okay, well, that's a little bit of European history of limnology, but there are also developments taking place here in North America. So one of these fellows prominent in North American limnology was a fellow by the name of Louis Agassiz. He's Swiss, and he's the originator of the glacial theory. So those of you who are in the earth sciences may have heard of him previously. So he was a professor of both geology and zoology at Harvard University. And in 1850, he published a volume on Lake Superior, its physical character, vegetation, animals. And in fact, there's a huge lake that no longer exists, but there was at the end of the last ice age, there was a huge lake that covered most of Manitoba, parts of Ontario, and stretched across into Saskatchewan, that we refer to as Glacial Lake Agassiz. And so this is a lake that was named in recognition of his contributions, I guess, to the origins of glacial theory. Now, in the last year, I became aware of a bit of a controversy about Louis Agassiz. He apparently didn't have the most enlightened views with respect to races and so on. And so, you know, I'm wondering at some point, is there going to be a campaign to rename this lake? Kind of escape people to this point, but given his views and the controversy surrounding him, maybe that will be a thing in the future. Maybe not too far into the future. Okay. Also in North America, there was a school of limnology that was established at Lake Mendota at the University of Wisconsin. It was established by two scientists, Burge and Jude. And Chauncey Jude and Ed Burge published extensively on limnology during the early 1900s, so 1900 to 1910, so that sort of time period, maybe a little bit later than that. But anyway, they published on a huge array of things. They published on the heat budget of the lake, the bottom fauna of the lake, the productivity of the lake, dissolved gases in the lake, organic matter in the lake, phosphorus in the lake, and so on. So a lot of the most detailed early North American limnological research was conducted there at Lake Mendota by a team led by these two scientists. Another prominent American limnologist, George Evelyn Hutchinson, lived from 1903 to 1991. Well, I guess he was born in Britain, so he's regarded as an Anglo-American zoologist. Anyway, he established a very influential limnological research group at Yale. And over the years, he published a comprehensive 4-volume treatise on limnology. So the first volume came out in 1957. Then the second one came out in 1967, third in 1975, and the third in 1993. So took him a long time to get all 4 volumes out. And actually, you know, so what's that, about 35 years it took for that to be published in total. So you can see there's 10 years between the first 2 volumes. They're very, very comprehensive. And I'm sure one of the problems that he was facing was that as limnology advanced as a science, he was having more and more trouble keeping up with the limnological research. You know, to make this a truly comprehensive and up to date, he had to be continually trying to incorporate more and more research into each of these volumes as they came out. And in fact, the last volume, published in 1993, you'll notice it was published 2 years after George Evelyn Hutchinson passed away. So it was published, I think with help from his son, 2 years after he passed away. There are also prominent Canadian limnologists. One that is a person of importance in Canadian limnology is Don Rawson. He was a professor of biology at the University of Saskatchewan, so he's regarded as a limnological pioneer in Canada. And he published extensively on lakes in Western Canada, including saline lakes and alpine lakes. And he also published on fish production in lakes. Now here he's very important in terms of limnology because he conducted in the 1930s the earliest surveys of our Okanagan lakes, or at least the main Okanagan lakes. So he was here in the 1930s studying Okanagan Lake and Skaha Lake and Wood Lake and Kalamalka Lake, all of those major lakes in the Okanagan. And so that gives us kind of a baseline for what the lakes were like back in the 1930s that when we used to compare with conditions in the lakes today. Another prominent Canadian limnologist is Noel Hines. Now, I studied for a period at University of Waterloo and met Noel Hines there. Anyway, Noel Hines was born in Britain, but moved to Canada. And anyway, he is not known for his work on lakes. He's known for his work on streams. And he published 2 classic books on stream biology. He's regarded as the father of running water ecology. And at one point he was reputed to be the world's most renowned freshwater biologist. Anyway, when he came to Canada, he essentially established the biology department at the University of Waterloo. And in doing so, he established a very influential freshwater biology research group. In establishing the department, you know, he needed some botanists for a biology department. So he tended to hire people that worked on aquatic plants. He needed zoologists. So he'd hire people that worked on fish and with freshwater invertebrates, and so on. So he tended to collect people around in the biology department at University of Waterloo that could focus on freshwater biology. Another prominent Canadian limnologist, Jack Valentine, who is also known as Johnny Biosphere. Anyway, Jack passed away a few years ago, back in 2007. And he was regarded as one of the gods of the Canada Centre for Inland Waters. This is a federal government institution in Burlington, Ontario, just outside Hamilton. So he was one of the key people there. And what he's best known for is for his work to develop legislation controlling the amount of phosphates in detergents and its release into fresh waters, because phosphates are the amount of phosphate gets into a lake tends to control how much you get in terms of algal blooms. Since the more phosphates get in to a lake or a stream, the more algal blooms you tend to get, and we tend not to like waters with lots of algal blooms. Anyway, Jack was a very outspoken environmentalist, and he would regularly go around and give presentations to public schools. And he'd go out as this character, Jack Valentine, or rather as Johnny Biosphere, with a globe on the back on the top of a backpack on his back. And we had him speak on campus a couple of times over the years. He used to occasionally show up in Kelowna, and one of the reasons he would show up in Kelowna in particular was he had a son who was a physician here in Kelowna. And maybe his son is still a physician, or maybe he's retired, but as far as I know, his son still lives here in Kelowna. Now, another very prominent Canadian limnologist is or was David Schindler. Now, David Schindler was, until his retirement, Killam Memorial Professor of Ecology at the University of Alberta. He founded and directed also a federal government research station, the Experimental Lakes area near Kenora, Ontario. He was a principal at the Freshwater Institute in Winnipeg. Anyway, he's very famous for whole lake experimental manipulations of lakes. So he was involved in these early work on nutrient inputs to lakes, controls on nutrient inputs to lakes, and acidification. And so up in the experimental lakes area, they would do research where they might take a lake and add nitrogen or phosphorus or carbon or some combination of those to the lake to see how they responded, to demonstrate the importance of controlling nutrients to regulating water quality. Anyway, he's very famous for these manipulations, and I think he passed away maybe in just the last year. That's pretty recently. Jeff Curtis, some of you may know, another one of our faculty members, he was a student of David Schindler's. Anyway, David Schindler was the first ever winner of the Stockholm Water Prize. Is the first ever winner of the Stockholm Water Prize, and this is widely regarded as the equivalent of a Nobel Prize in freshwater research. Here in British Columbia, a fellow who's very prominent in terms of limnology is Tom Northcote. Tom Northcote was a professor of zoology, and he retired in 1992, so almost exactly 30 years ago. I was at his retirement dinner in the fall of 1991 in Okanagan Falls after we did a joint field trip to Mahoney Lake. Anyway, so he was a professor of zoology at UBC, and he conducted much of the original limnological and fisheries research in the province. Here locally, one of the things he's best known for is as one of the leads on the Okanagan Basin study. So I mentioned that Donald Rawson had done some limnological surveys here in the Okanagan back in the 1930s. Well, Tom and John Stockner were involved in what was referred to as the Okanagan Basin study. It was a second major survey of the Okanagan lakes. Anyway, Tom passed away, maybe about 3 or 4 years ago. I'm not quite exactly sure there, but he was a pioneer also in studying forestry fisheries interactions. He retired to Summerland, but as I said, he's now passed away. Oh, and one other thing, he was a major donor to our library. So back when he retired, he donated most of his personal library to our campus. And our campus at that time was a part of Okanagan University College. Okanagan, our campus, this campus of Okanagan University College later evolved into what we now regard as UBC Okanagan. So just to summarize then, things that I've been talking about. So limnology encompasses all aspects of the study of inland waters, okay? It encompasses running waters and standing waters, very big waters, very small waters, fresh waters, saline waters, so wide array of different inland water ecosystems. I've gone over, some European history, so the foundations of limnological research we trace back to people like Farrell and Naumann and Tienemann and others in Europe. Here in North America, Yale University and the University of Wisconsin were prominent early centers for limnological research, but there are also some very key players in this in Canada. People like Tom Northcote, David Schindler, Don Rawson, John Small at Queen's University, among others. Canada has a huge number of lakes and fresh waters, and so consequently, people have tended to attach a lot of importance to limnological research here in Canada. Okay, now let's see. Stop sharing my screen and I can take a look, see whether people have any questions here. Okay, if anyone has a question, you could perhaps type it into the box here right away. Otherwise, I guess we'll sign off and we'll call it a day. Okay, not seeing anything. See you on Thursday.